For materials I chose laminated spruce because that is very cheap and readily available, and I love the light colors. When the individual pieces of spruce are laminated together to form a panel, they are normally glued up with an alternating growth ring pattern to keep the panels even more stable. Spruce is sometimes discarded and seen only as a construction material, but you can actually make quite beautiful furniture out of spruce. Just make sure that there's no resin pockets, loose knots or pith in the piece you're selecting. And I ripped the pieces to the right width for the sides of the drawers on my table saw. Cutting those pieces to length, I had to be really careful not to end up with any knots or other irregularities at the ends where we'll cut the dovetails. Those knots would just be very hard to cut and cause all sorts of problems like splintering and burning, so it's best to avoid them at the ends. So here are our pieces, and I'm now gonna plane away the saw marks because I really don't feel like sanding them away after the drawers assembled. With a sharp block plane, removing those saw marks is just a matter of seconds. The next step is sanding and varnishing the insides of the drawer. I hit the insides with 240 grit sandpaper right away. Then I masked off the joint areas because wood glue doesn't really stick very well to varnish, and I used 2 offcuts of the same material to help me position the tape. And for a finish I gave them a generous coat of varnish. And then I hit them with some 400 grit sandpaper, hand sanding in the direction of the grain. And then I gave them another coat of clear varnish. This way I got a silky smooth finish and quite a hard surface. And after the varnish had dried, it was time to cut the rabbets for the bottom. I'm using a rabbeting bit in the router table, but you can of course use a handheld router or a table saw. And I set the vertical depth of cut to a little more than the thickness of the drawer bottom. And locked that in. And the horizontal depth of cut to about 12 mm, because that will leave about 5 mm of our drawer sides, which is a reasonable amount. And after installing a featherboard to prevent kickback and keep the pieces tight against the fence, these rabbets were cut in just about a couple of minutes. Despite of its size, this big bit is supposed to run at 16,000 RPMs, which makes it a real beast at removing material quickly. Now switching from the biggest cutter right to the smallest cutter to round over these edges. A 2 mm radius roundover gives the pieces a nice finished look. I never solely rely on the guide bearing, because if there are any irregularities in the wood, like a hole from a knot, that cutter will just plunge into that hole and ruin the workpiece. And that is exactly what I've been talking about. Now for the glue up. This is the time to think about where the pins of those dovetails will have to end up, because if we determine this now, we will not need any clamps to glue up that drawer, and it will be a lot easier. So I marked the center line of those pins, 2 spaced about 15 mm in from either side and 1 in the middle. And now using the locations where the pins will end up for screws, I can glue and screw that drawer together. I used pocket hole screws because they have a flat head and do not dig into the wood. But because the spruce is really quite soft, I added some additional washers to protect it. With those screws, the pieces can still be moved a little bit if needed, but will otherwise stay where they are, which makes this method a lot easier than using clamps where those pieces would just slide all over the place. And while the glue dries, I prepare the drawer bottom. This is a piece of 7mm pine plywood, which I pre-varnished just like the inside of the drawer. And the bottom just drops into those rabbets. I keep the screw holes a little bit more towards the insides of the rabbets to keep those countersinks away from the edge of the plywood to prevent splintering. Just a little detail. A screwed-on bottom has a number of advantages, mainly that it will always stay tight against the sides and simplify construction of the drawer, because there's no dado that has to be cut very precisely. If that rabbet is off by a little bit, it doesn't matter. Also, you're not wasting any potentially valuable cabinet space with the part of the drawer that is underneath the bottom to hold it up. And now with the bottom screwed on, the drawer is rigid enough to remove those screws and cut the dovetails. I'm using a 15-degree dovetail cutter in my router. You really don't need a powerful router for this operation. Any small router will do just fine. Maybe not a Dremel. And I'm gonna clamp the drawer down on its side. And for cutting the dovetails, I made this simple jig. And this jig clamps down to the corner of our drawer using a speed clamp. The router is guided between those two fences, and down there is a backer piece to prevent tear out, and underneath is a port for connecting the shop vac in order to contain all the dust. So this is basically what's gonna happen. The router bit will cut a trapezoidal stopped groove into our workpiece. This jig can now be placed right over those screw holes, which means when we cut the dovetail, the screw holes essentially get cut away. And here I have marked my depth of cut. Now I can line up my dovetail cutter with my mark. Here I have this angled piece of steel rod, and that's gonna be our depth stop. Now we just need to connect the shop vac and cut the dovetails. And now we just need to make the pins. I'm gonna use some salvaged mahogany from an old window frame, because that will make for a nice contrast to the light colors of the spruce. And yes, that was a pretty nasty nail. I'm tilting the blade to 15 degrees because that was the angle of the dovetail cutter. And now just sneaking up to that perfect fit. The cool thing about these dowels is that you can pre-make a whole bunch of them for other projects, because they will always fit no matter what the material thicknesses you're working with. Finally, these dowels can be cut to a more manageable length. And now it's time to glue them in. First I spread glue in the cutout, then I chamfer the edges of the dowel to keep it from scraping off the glue and instead trap the glue between the mating surfaces. And then I spread some glue in the dowel and push it into place. The excess dowel stock can now be trimmed off at the table saw. Now it's time for a finish. I sanded the drawer up to 240 grit with my random orbit sander, and then varnished all the exposed surfaces using a clear varnish. After that was dry, I gave it a light hand sanding in the direction of the grain with some 400 grit paper, and then put on the final coat of clear varnish. And after the finish was fully dry, I screwed on the full extension drawer slides. And I positioned them to be flush with the bottom of the drawer. And of course these drawer slides complement those dovetails really nicely. But this drawer had to be made as space efficient as possible, so no invisible undermount slides for this one. And that is the moment of truth. But it fits perfectly. And the slides are screwed into the kitchen cabinet using 2 sticks as spacers to keep them off of the cabinet bottom. And after the slides were screwed in place, the drawer could be pushed in to make the slides lock together again. And after screwing on the front, which I had previously positioned, the drawer was finished. So this was finally the last one of the new drawers for our kitchen.